Hi everybody and welcome. Delighted to be here this evening working with Twinkl for this introduction to dyslexia. Very important session, and we can see there's been great attendance, so that's really exciting, and we're looking forward to talking through with you. So just briefly to introduce myself, my name is Jane Craig and I'm the founding director of our charity Dyslexia Sparks. We are based just outside of Hull, covering Hull and the East Riding of Yorkshire primarily. And we provide dyslexia assessments, dyslexia specialist tuition, dyslexia training, and all sorts of wraparound care to families and young people and adults of people of all ages across that region. So it's we're a very busy small team, but we're really excited to be here this evening. Tiny little bit about my background. So I've specialised in dyslexia for 10 years now, and prior to that I worked in the higher education sector as a university lecturer. And my background is psychology. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Sam, who's going to take us through the first few things of this evening.
Hi, thank you, Jane. Good evening, everybody. My name is Sam, and I am Head of Teaching and Learning at Dyslexia Sparks. I've been with the charity since we started in 2016. I'm a specialist teacher and a specialist assessor as well. I'm also dyslexic myself, so I have lots of interesting snippets into the way I work and potentially how some of our students would work as well. Okay. So just a quick overview of what it is that we're going to look through this evening. So the first thing we're going to have a brief overview of is what is dyslexia, what that means, and the sort of things that we would look for when given a diagnosis of dyslexia. Ways of spotting dyslexia and dyslexic students in a classroom, and what sort of things we would advise you to be looking out for when trying to identify dyslexic individuals in your class. We're going to have a think about some of the challenges that our dyslexic students will face in the classroom as well. And a really brief little look at how we can support our dyslexic students in the classroom. So I think it's important that we take a moment to think about why we need to understand dyslexia better, and why dyslexia training is important. Typically, or previously, always used to say research said there was 1 in 10 in our classrooms that would be dyslexic. It is more like 1 in 5 that we're sort of looking at now. Current research sort of says, and it's important so we can support all our dyslexic learners in the classroom and allow them to achieve what their potential is. So not just bumbling along and making some progress. We want them to be able to achieve what they're capable of doing. It's really important that we make sure that dyslexic learners feel confident in their learning and the strategies that they need to support their learning, not just going through school, but beyond that into the workplace as well. And that's it. So equipping dyslexic learners for further education and in the world of work. So what is dyslexia? Often we get asked why dyslexia is so hard to spell. So the origins of the word, the dys comes from difficulty and the lexis is language, and that's what the word itself means, is a difficulty with words or language. The modern definition, the definition that was brought out universally in 2016 was about the language learning and cognition, but we identify that it primarily impacts word reading and spelling. More recently, in the last few months, we've had a lot of research carried out, and the definition of dyslexia has changed slightly, not in terms of how we would support dyslexic learners or how we would identify it as such, but it's there to support those who are assessing for dyslexia and how they would go through that process more. So there are 4 key indicators that we look for when when doing an assessment for dyslexia. There are 4 key areas that we look for weaknesses in. So the first one is phonological awareness, and that is basically how we process sounds. So how we hear sounds, how we blend them together, how we separate them apart. So that making sense of sounds in words. And that's one of the key areas we look for when identifying dyslexia. The second area is our phonological memory. So this is how we hold sounds in our short-term and working memory. So this area impacts significantly on reading and spelling, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail. Our auditory short-term and working memory, so it's how we hold on to information and how we can change or manipulate that information while holding it in our short-term memory. And the fourth area is our speed of information processing. This really impacts the learning of new ideas or new information, and how we can respond to questions or giving information back when asked about certain information. And each of these areas we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail. So our phonological awareness, so it says about identifying and blending and manipulating sounds, but how that would actually look in a learner in your classroom. So one of the areas that would potentially be a difficulty is that initial learning of phonics, learning the sounds and how they link to those letters. So it may be at those initial stages of learning phonics there would be a difficulty. We also see difficulties with using those phonics for reading, so identifying those sounds within words and how those sounds come together, so that blending of those sounds, as well as identifying individual letters as well. Using phonics for spelling, so how we would apply those sounds and those letter patterns to different spellings. Remembering spelling patterns as well can often be a key indicator of difficulties with phonological awareness. The processing of verbal instructions, so how we would listen to those instructions and how we would process that information that's given. If we can see a student or a learner having difficulties with that, they may be having difficulties with their phonological awareness. And also spelling words during writing as well. So all these things vary from student to student. So some may have a higher need or a larger difficulty in one area than the other, and the varying degrees of difficulty within that as well. Okay, so we're going to try it for ourselves, or you are going to try it for yourself. Some of the activities we would look at when identifying difficulties with phonological awareness. So I know you're all on mute, so hopefully you can all say these nice and loud wherever you're working this evening. So I would like you to say the word sprand. Hopefully you've all said that out loud. So now I would like you to say sprand without the d. Spran, hopefully we all said. Now I would like you to say sprand without the s. So brand, hopefully we all came with. Now I would like you to say sprand without the n. Okay. And just think about how you find this process, how easy you find it. And then one last one, I would like you to say sprand without the r. Okay, so I'd like you to just take a moment to think about that activity there and think about how easy that activity for you, how easy that activity was for you. Which sounds did you find easier to take away? So usually most of us find the first and the last sound the easiest to take off. They're usually the easier ones, the ones that we can do more easily. When it starts to get more complex is during those middle sounds, and particularly when it's a blend like spr and that r is already attached to that chunk of sound. So pulling out some of those sounds can be a little bit more difficult for our dyslexic learners. Also, the fact that it's a nonsense word, it's a made-up word, is making that probably a little bit more difficult for some people as well. So moving on to our phonological memory. Our phonological memory is there's blending those sounds into words, okay? And when we have difficulties with phonological memory, it can bring up some difficulties with different processes. And again, with all our dyslexic learners, this is different for everybody. They may find certain aspects easier than others. So your phonological memory is temporary memory, and it works over a few seconds to keep track of phonological information, to keep track of those sounds. So some of the things you might see in a classroom with a student is they may forget the sounds. So they may be able to identify sounds in a word, but they may forget them after they've identified them. During that blending process, so they may be able to identify those sounds, but then they may confuse the order of those sounds. So during that blending process, they may get all the right sounds that they've identified, but the order may be slightly mixed up. We also see students who can correctly identify the sounds in words. However, when they blend those sounds together, they may replace the sound with an incorrect sound. So put a different sound in there. Or they may forget a sound or multiple sounds altogether. So when you are reading with one of your students, if they show any difficulties in these sorts of areas, it may be that they have weaknesses with their phonological memory. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is, hopefully you can all see your screen, and we're going to have a little look at how potentially this may feel, for a dyslexic learner. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop some Greek letters up on the screen for you that I'd like you to have a quick look at. So what I was trying to show you there is how these Greek letters represent sounds. So seeing those sounds for a really short period of time, if we flick onto those and we're looking and we're trying to hold those in our short-term and working memory. So we're linking those particular shapes, those graphemes, to these particular letters, and then how we would piece that together to make a word. All right, so holding that information for a really short amount of time and being able to piece that together. I think lots of you saw the answer, unfortunately, before you got to see what the letter allocation was. Okay, but what those with phonological memory difficulties would experience would be that they would find it difficult to identify a sound and sometimes associate it with a given sound straight away. So some of those are probably a little bit easier than others. So this pi symbol is quite closely linked. You know, you might associate that with the sound because you've got some prior knowledge that you can link those things together. The one that looks like an X to make the ch sound is quite unusual. So they sort of stand out a little bit. So being able to pull that from your memory and then also put all those sounds together, so that there's different areas of phonological awareness there, but then that phonological memory, being able to recall that information when required. Obviously, we wouldn't have given you very long to have a look at those things anyway. And dyslexic learners will need much longer to reinforce that sort of information and be able to recall that more automatically than other learners around them. And also being able to have that delivered in a way that suits their needs and their strengths as well. Right, I'm just going to pass you over to Jane for the next part.
Super, thank you, Sam. All right, so we talked a bit there about phonological memory, very specific part of the short-term working memory. But Sam also mentioned earlier on, one of the key aspects of dyslexia in terms of cognitive processing is auditory short-term and working memory. So now really what we're looking at is more generally the memory for short-term, for information in the short-term and working memory. It doesn't necessarily have to be related to sounds. So this will help a learner in terms of learning new information, but it will also help with things like following instructions, and particularly things like staying focused are often very much linked to working memory. So just briefly to give you a bit of information about the difference between those two things, the short-term memory is how much information we can hold for just a really short amount of time. So we're talking about working over just a few seconds. It's very temporary. We might imagine it's a bit like a shelf in the brain, and everybody's shelf is a different length. Often for dyslexic learners, their shelf will be a little bit shorter than the typical, the short-term memory shelf, and therefore they can't hold as much information on it. And when too much information starts to get put onto that shelf, it will start to drop off. So only certain things will remain in terms of being remembered. And in order then to get it into the long-term memory, we need to do stuff with it. We need to be doing something active with that information. But if things have already dropped off in terms of the short-term memory shelf, then there's going to be less going into the long-term memory. So that's part of the reason that it makes it hard for dyslexic learners to learn new things and to remember instructions, particularly if there's lots of detail in there. Working memory is a multitasker. So it's an active memory store. It's a little bit like, we could imagine it's a bit like a post-it note stuck on the front of our heads, and it is right at the front of the brain there, because it's a bit like sort of jotting down notes as we're going through something. So a couple of real world examples of that in terms of the classroom academic life. So mental arithmetic is a perfect example of working memory, because we're having to hold information in our working memory, but also do something with it at the same time. We're having to change it to manipulate it. So we're trying to keep track of lots of things at the same time. Our working memory is going into the long-term memory to try and think about, what solutions have I got to this problem? What do I already know that can help me solve this? What have I learned before that I can bring to the forefront? So there's lots and lots going on. You can imagine it's very, working really, really hard, that multitasker, very active memory store. Another example of that would be in terms of reading. So I'll get onto that in a minute in terms of giving you sort of a bit of explanation about how that might work as well. So it affects in lots of different ways in terms of the classroom. And what we've got here is a few things for you to consider that you might see your learners doing that might indicate there's difficulties with short-term and working memory. So sometimes we might have those students who seem to ask the same questions lots and lots of times. Okay, and it might be, as a teacher, you might think, I've explained this, why aren't they getting it? All right, now it may well be, if that short-term memory is a difficulty, there's just too much information being given, they just can't keep track of it all. It might be that the working memory is letting them down because they're trying to begin the work, and then they then they forget what they were doing because they're so immersed in trying to solve whatever that problem is, that piece of work. So then they're asking questions, and they may be the same questions repeated in terms of what we're doing, what the task is, and confusion about what's going on. Now, you might find, you know, as learners get older, depending on the students that you're working with, sometimes that kind of pulls back a bit, doesn't it? So younger learners, typically in primary school, often might be more relaxed about asking questions. They feel sort of more nurtured in the classroom. Older learners might begin to retreat a bit from that. And often that's where it's really important to sort of keep an eye on those students and really get to know your learners in terms of what things might they find difficult, when might they need a bit of reassurance about things, when might they need that little one-on-one time to check that they know what they're doing, what the task is. They may not feel they can ask that question in front of lots of people. We've got the teenage years kick in terms of the embarrassment of that as well. And I know lots of our learners talk about that. So there's lots of things that may be impacting them on asking those questions. So you might see a student asking lots of questions or the same questions, but you might, you know, some of them might be a bit quieter, so just keep an eye out for them as well. In terms of short-term and working memory, a very typical sort of thing that you might see in terms of a difficulty for a dyslexic learner would be not being able to remember all or part of previously learned information. So we've gone over a topic in a previous session, that might be yesterday, it might be a week ago, and there's bits of that have dropped off. And that's because they've got that limitation in terms of their short-term memory, and also things aren't making their way into the long-term memory potentially. It might be that a learner just doesn't seem to know what they're meant to be doing at all. All right, that might for them present as them sort of just sitting and doing nothing. All right, you might think they're just being they're not engaged for some reason, and you know they can't be bothered, but it could be that they don't know what they're meant to be doing. They might turn around and be starting to ask their mate, their friend, you know, what am I meant to be doing? And that sometimes can be seen as you know, not conforming to the rules of the classroom, particularly if we're, you know, wanting to do quiet work. So it might be they just don't know what they're meant to be doing. And we need to try and unpick that a little bit in terms of understanding why that is and what we can do to support. And Sam and I will go through that a little bit this evening in terms of some ideas from us. We might often see spelling mistakes during writing. And I think that's the reason I'm highlighting that, is because lots of teachers will see spelling mistakes, but sometimes dyslexic students can do quite well on spelling tests, not always, but sometimes, and we do hear this quite a lot, they will practice for that weekly test and they might do okay. And there's probably all sorts of reasons they're managing that. A lot of that might be to do with, for example, using things like their visual memory, or other skills they've got, other strengths they've got that are supporting them with that sort of short-term fix in terms of the test. Now, when it comes to writing, there's a lot more involved in that, and you're going to see a piece of writing shortly, an example of a piece of writing from a dyslexic student. There's so much involved in the process of writing that's when often those working memory difficulties will become more of an issue for them, because they're having to think about what I'm going to write, how it should be spelled, how I should form the letters, maybe in terms of handwriting, where do I put the punctuation, and then something drops, and it might be that their spelling and their writing is quite different to when they're spelling individual words. And I mentioned in terms of reading, working memory is very important. So Sam's talked a lot about the short-term memory store in terms of phonological memory and phonological awareness, which clearly impacts on reading skills. But in terms of working memory and reading, we often see lots of difficulties there in terms of more the understanding of reading and forgetting what we've read. So the working memory would help us out, for example, if we come across a word we've never seen before, and we're trying to decode it to work out what it says, we would be trying to think about what do we already know to help me with reading this word. So we're calling on that phonological memory, we're calling on the phonological awareness to try and decode the word. Now, if we've got weaknesses with working memory, it's going to be really hard to keep track of what we've read before, because we're working so hard on that current problem being that word we want to decode. And we'll all have probably seen those learners who, you know, every word is a battle, and it's very difficult then to make sense of what we've read and remember it first of all, and therefore make sense of it. And that then can be often where dyslexic learners become very tired, frustrated, disengaged with learning, in terms of the reading process, reluctance to read, all sorts of things that creep in there, unfortunately, that are very justifiable in terms of why that is for them and the difficulties they're going through. So loads of impacts that short-term and working memory can have in terms of the classroom and things you might see. We're going to have a really quick go now at a memory activity and give you a little glimpse into what it might feel a little bit like being a dyslexic learner in the classroom and sort of trying to keep track of different things that are going on. So I'm going to show you a list and I want you to memorize it, and you're not going to have long to do it. No writing down during this process. Just look at the list and remember it if you can. Okay, so you've seen the list. Now I want you to do a different task. And this is where I mentioned you're going to see a piece of text that a dyslexic child has written. So you're going to have a look at this piece of text. I want you to have a go at rewriting the passage. So you're going to have to make sense of this learner's work, rewrite it correctly as far as you interpret it, and including the correct punctuation, spelling, etc. Okay, so here's the passage. I'll give you just a short amount of time to have a go at this. Okay, so we've got sort of people thinking possibly there's a hunter in there, the dog got shot, there's maybe a funeral, there's a bear with a birthday. There's a lot of this stuff going on in this passage, isn't there? So this young learner is definitely finding it hard to get his ideas down in a sort of straight, linear fashion, you know, in terms of making sense of those ideas. We see that we would say is quite typical dyslexic brain. There's lots of ideas going on. It's quite creative, but making sense of it for us as somebody who doesn't know this learner is harder, definitely. So thank you all for having a go at that. Hopefully that's given you, you know, sort of a little bit of an insight into what that might look like. Quite a strong example of dyslexic writing, I would say, there, in terms of lots of things going on. We've not got much in terms of punctuation. There's some difficulties with letter reversals and letter formation as well. Lots of things going on. Okay, now what I'd like you to do next is have a go at writing down what you remember from the list that I asked you to memorize. We're going to have a quick chat about that, but before I do, I'll just put you out of your misery and show you what the list was for those who need to know what they got right, and which ones that they remembered. And I can see that from the responses, there's quite a few people have not got everything. All right. And there's probably some good reason for that in terms of the way that I've designed that activity, what I've got you to do there. So we did have 7 items altogether, and some of you may have got all of those. Now, my guess is that you will have been using some sort of strategies to help you remember the list. So initially I told you I want you to memorize a list. All right, so I've been very explicit with what the task was and that it's a memory task. So straight away the chances are that your brain is kicked into gear, that, you know, thinking, right, what can I do to remember this information? Whether or not you've got a strong short-term and working memory or not, you will have immediately be on guard. Right, I need to think about this. So you'll have probably already straight away thought, right, what strategies can I use? You may well have been using repetition. That's a very common strategy that we see and get reported back to us. So just repeating that list over and over and over again as many times as you could in that short space of time as a way of remembering it. And that's a strategy lots of us will use for remembering information in the short term. You may have been using visualization. We quite often hear from people that they are picturing maybe a dinner on a plate. We've got the different vegetables on there, the meat, and that's a way of helping us to remember those different food items possibly. We might have been using some sort of grouping or chunking system. So we might have just grouped them in terms of, let's say we split it into a 3 and a 4 or 2, 2, 3. We might have just done it in terms of making it less information, chunks of less information. Okay. We might have used chunking to group them somehow in terms of how they're related. So some people say the biscuits and the cheese go together. They might be thinking about a dinner and the different categories of food. So those sorts of chunks that are actually related to each other is slightly different from just grouping in terms of how many pieces of information. But that is a really important one, actually, because in terms of how our memory works, the understanding of that has moved on quite a lot. So previously, long time ago, when I first did my psychology degree, the number that was talked about all the time was 7, in terms of 7 pieces of information that the average adult can hold in their short-term memory. And that's at that time, that's what some of the studies showed. So that was given as the sort of golden piece of information about short-term memory for a really long time. And you may have heard of that sort of in other situations. We've moved on a lot from that now, and we understand that actually the way that the short-term memory tends to work is it naturally will organize information, group it. And what's quite typical for most adults is we can remember probably about 3 to 4 chunks of information. Within that, we might have some more pieces of information, but we tend to chunk. That's kind of how the short-term memory works. Now, what's important, and I'll come on to this again in a minute, is that isn't necessarily what the dyslexic brain will do naturally. Okay, so when I'm talking about generally what might happen, that tends to be across the board rather than we're talking about specific, the dyslexic brain there. The other thing that often happens with that memory activity is people use association to help themselves remember it. So, for example, we've had people say very detailed descriptions of going into the supermarket. I can see where the cheese is, the biscuits are, and I'm going in my head, I'm walking through and I'm making an association there. So associating that information with something that is familiar to you and is linkable to your long-term memory is a really brilliant memory strategy. And that's a really great one that you can use with your learners when you're looking at how better for them to remember information, making it memorable because it's associated with something that they already are familiar with or they already know. And the final one that we often see is people using rhythm. So this is it's a bit like the alphabet song, the nursery rhymes. If we do this with secondary school teachers, the music teachers are so obvious straight away because they're full table, he's sat there jumping up and down and almost singing it some of the time. So rhythm, it can be really helpful for remembering information as well. And that's partly why we teach the alphabet and those nursery rhymes with the rhythm when we start, because that is part of our phonological awareness as well, and it helps to develop those skills. So that can be helpful. As I mentioned when I was talking about grouping, be aware lots of dyslexic learners won't use these strategies without being shown how to. That isn't always true. And as Sam's mentioned, dyslexic profiles do vary because people will find their ways to use their strengths and ways to compensate for the things that they find harder. But often dyslexic learners won't naturally use these strategies because these areas are weak for them. So they will need to have them modeled. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes' time. So what I'm going to do is move on and talk about the last area of cognitive processing that we look at in a dyslexia assessment that helps us identify if somebody's dyslexic and which can affect across lots of areas in terms of learning. And that is speed of processing. So speed of processing, the reason that I've got a child riding a bike here, because I like to use the analogy that, everyone processes information at a different speed. And we'll need different sort of levels of support, scaffolding, structure to go with that. So when a child learns to ride a bike, we don't expect them to just be able to ride it straight away. We use different forms of support. So they may have stabilizers to support to begin with, so that there's less elements for them to have to consider. They don't have to consider the balance. Then we bring in other things along the way, step by step, and we get to the point where we're running alongside them to help them learn to ride that bike. And after practicing that and with that scaffold, that support at different levels, they will get to the point, most children, where they can do that automatically without having to think about it. And people would say the same about learning to drive a car. There's so many elements when you first learn. You've got to think about all these different things, and then it all comes together and we can do it automatically. And ideally, that's the point we sort of want to get our learners to, isn't it, with things like reading and spelling. We don't want them to have to think too hard about it. We want it all to be automatic. but they will need different levels of support along the way and different amounts of time to go through that process as well. So all individuals vary in terms of their speed of processing. It isn't linked to intelligence. So we often meet some of the most brilliantly intelligent people, but for whom need information delivered at a slower pace or need more time to process and go back over it. And speed of processing, most of the evidence tells us it can't be improved at a cognitive level, whereas things like phonological awareness, memory, can be improved to a certain degree with the right sort of intervention. Speed of processing is fairly fixed within the brain, and as we get older, it slows down. So it doesn't tend to speed up in itself. What we can do instead is help in terms of the way we deliver information and using those individuals' strengths to overcome that difficulty. So in terms of speed of processing, and just a little bit of information on that in terms of giving information and what we expect, we can look at the information that comes in, the receptive language, and the information that comes out, the expressive language. So we've got 3 generally broad ways of language coming in: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. And typically for dyslexic learners, the visual processing may well be a difficulty, particularly when it comes to literacy. Auditory processing is often going to be a weakness in terms of phonological awareness and phonological memory. And we know that often dyslexic learners work better in a practical, hands-on way. So wherever we can adapt things to make it so that it's got some form of hands-on support, that's probably going to help them with their speed of processing. But the other side of that is the output. So what are we asking them to do with that information? Are we asking them to write something down? That's probably going to be quite hard for them. They may need more time to think through their answers, but often dyslexic learners are stronger verbally than they are in writing, and we often all see that. And not always, but often dyslexic learners are good with producing hands-on practical outputs. And what we'll do in a few minutes time is just think about, we'll give you some examples of what that would look like in the classroom, how you might adapt those things for those dyslexic learners. And so before I hand on to Sam, just to say, we have gone through things quite quickly because of the time this evening, but the idea of some of these activities is to help you sort of see what it would feel like to be a dyslexic learner and start to think for yourself what things might you need to adapt or tweak or just adjust a little bit. That there might be things you're doing at the moment that might just not quite be the best, most helpful things for dyslexic learners. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Sam and we're going to talk about some of our ideas for how you might support in the classroom.
Thank you, Jane. Okay, so different ways that we suggest that you can support your dyslexic learners in the classroom. I'm going to go through these and then we're going to take a little bit of time to go through each one in turn. So to scaffold learning for dyslexic learners, to use visual resources alongside whatever it is that you're teaching. Adapting the expected output can be really a positive thing for a dyslexic learner. So we will go into that in slightly more detail. Developing memory skills specifically, so specifically teaching memory strategies and also some self-help strategies there as well will support our dyslexic learners in the classroom. So thinking about scaffolded learning, often for a dyslexic learner, one of the biggest barriers that they will face is just getting started. I know this from very personal experience. Sometimes it's all there, it's all in the head. But where does that start? What do I do with that? So sentence starters or sentence openers can be just that key to unlocking some of that information for them to be able to get started. And then once we've started that process of getting some of that information out or answering some of that, those questions that you're potentially asking can make a really big difference to a dyslexic learner. Providing word banks for writing, again, can be really a supportive strategy, but Often learners don't automatically know how to use that. They may struggle with reading those words, so some sort of pictorial support with that would be helpful as well. But being shown how to do these things and how to use things like a word bank, and not sort of expecting them to know what to do with those words if they are given. I feel as a teacher, teaching vocabulary is one of the most difficult things to do. So being able to pre-teach vocabulary for specific topic areas, and being able to give them some time to look at those words maybe before the topic starts, again maybe linked to pictures, as well as the words themselves, it is really, really valuable to a dyslexic learner. So when they're coming up against those new words or that vocabulary, they've had some experience of that before. Using those pictures or images to support reading. Usually we get to a certain age and those sorts of things are taken away from our students, from our learners. But pictures do give some of those clues and things, those contextual clues that they may need. And sort of getting to year 2, maybe year 3, most dyslexic learners will need some of those pictures or those images to support their reading beyond that sort of age group. But on that, being really careful with busy wall displays. Classrooms can be the most beautiful places that you go into, but sometimes it's quite overwhelming when you see what's around you and what's on the wall. And you may have a wall with lots of vocabulary and you direct them to that wall. But if they're having difficulty identifying the words that they're looking for, that may just be more confusing for them. And again, that can then switch them off to it and think, I can't look up there, I can't use that. So as amazing and as fantastic some of these things that we can have around the classroom can be, some of them for a dyslexic learner can be quite overwhelming. Being able to use fillable notes, so being able to put the bits of information in that you want them to do, that you want them to identify, rather than starting a whole, whether it be note taking or making notes about something. Often a blank piece of paper is quite overwhelming as well on that getting started front. So being able to use fillable notes, what they can pick out the key pieces of information or pop their key pieces of information in, can be really supportive for a dyslexic learner as well. Other ways that we can support in the classroom is through visual resources, which I've just mentioned there. I completely appreciate as a classroom teacher how much time and effort goes into that, and you know, as a teaching team that we've got, we go through that process ourselves, but once those resources are made, they are there forever and they can be used again and again. They can be used at different age groups as well. Just because somebody is in year 6 or year 8 or 9 doesn't mean that these resources won't be just as valuable to them. So visual resources that we can use again and again are really good for learning vocabulary, something that I think is difficult to teach for learners, but also teaching topic words or foreign languages and things like that. You can also use things like that to support with memory activities, so linking words and pictures, or words and definitions, and then bringing that into a memory kind of activity. So once those resources are made, they can be used in lots of different ways. Being able to go doing fact-finding activities for different topics. Okay, so I've popped on here history and geography, but this is across the curriculum. And again, what often when we go find out information for ourselves, when we hunt that information down, we're more likely to remember it than just being told it and asked to remember it. Using colour coding can really help. recall information, but again, this is sometimes a strategy that will need some support around it, and being able to group things visually using mind maps and things as well, how different ideas link to one another. But again, lots of that support comes before that, in being taught those processes and how we learn those.
So just to finish off in terms of the visual side of things that Sam was talking about, a brief example here at the beginning or earlier on, I asked you to remember a shopping list. Here I've got less piece of information just to illustrate the point, but 3 items of food. This time we've got a picture with each of them. Okay, so we've ramped it up in terms of the resources and the support there, and I'm sure you will all agree that immediately that is slightly more memorable, or you would, if I asked you to, find it more memorable because there's something visual there. It's not just a word on a page. Now we can also sort of enhance that a little bit more. So we could, for example, try to find a shortened version of that information. Here it quite neatly fits into BBC, whether or not your kids know what that is, but we've got an acronym, we've got a shortened version, okay, and that then can take the load off the short term, the working memory, because it's less information to remember because they're 3 letters as opposed to long words. What I've also included here is that we've got the B for bananas in yellow, bread is in brown, and cauliflower's green. So here this is sort of alluding to what Sam was saying about maybe color coding things, linking the colors to the colors of the items in this case, but you could use a color coding system for information when you want to introduce it, because the more we can do in terms of sort of categorizing the information in a visual what color coded way is probably going to really help your dyslexic learners to make links in that long-term memory and retrieve that information back out. And then let's say next time you come to review this topic, you just show them the 3 letters with the colored boxes, that they're going to have more chance of remembering that information because you've got a cue there, a much simpler cue for them to remember. Okay, so that's just a really simplified example of how we might do that in terms of remembering particular information. Sam mentioned as well about adapting output, and this is something that I think can be quite hard as a classroom teacher, depending on how much flexibility or autonomy you're giving in the classroom. It may be a conversation you might need to have at a slightly higher level in terms of some of how this works. But what we're suggesting is there ways you can adapt that output? Remember what we were talking about with speed of processing, what you're asking for in terms of accounting for those cognitive difficulties and hopefully taking into account strengths, which you're going to touch on just ever so slightly before we finish this evening. So on a very sort of brief level, first of all, can we ask for less in terms of the information we want them to provide? So that fillable form that Sam mentioned is a great example of that. It might be that all that student needs is the task breaking down into 3 smaller steps as opposed to 1 big task, right? And so we're not necessarily asking for less overall or as the end result, but we're asking for less at each stage to make it more manageable, to make there seem like there's less barriers for the dyslexic student there. That can also relieve a lot of the pressure, anxiety that they might feel, and that's so important because that will really impact on them if they've got difficulties with speed of processing and then they start to feel anxious. That's going to be really heightened. So that's a really good way that we can just start to remove some of those barriers. In terms of adapting output, just consider, is copying a necessary, helpful task? Lots of classrooms ask students to copy information down from the board, some more than others, particularly in secondary schools. We hear this a lot in certain subjects. And I would just urge you to think about why you're asking them to do that. What's the benefit? Is there a real purpose? Because we know there is so many dyslexic students will find that really challenging, holding that information in their working memory, getting it from the board down to the paper. And often they'll tell us they can't read everything that they're being asked to copy. So it really, it makes it very challenging for them, but it also doesn't really bring much benefit. So just think about how you could adapt that and what purpose that's serving, that copying task. And the final thing in terms of sort of adapting that expected output is, can we change what we're asking them to produce in terms of actually how they represent their knowledge? So for example, Could we ask for diagrams or mind maps instead of written sentences? And it may be that at some stage in the education, you know, depending on where they're in the curriculum, they need to turn that into sentences. But can we allow that dyslexic brain to work more in the way it might like to, which lends to its strengths in terms of presenting that information in a more visual format, in a more spread out format, as opposed to a linear format? Will typically, not always, but typically will be something that dyslexic learners will work better with. And there is a growing number of schools that are using those forms of evidence in their assessments within the classroom. So it is happening, and it is something that you could consider, and as I say, maybe at a higher level within your school. And we're moving on to our last few things that we want to talk through, but we've talked about memory skills. Sam mentioned helping to develop those and develop strategies. Our very strong belief is these can and should be taught and modelled. So we don't have to spend hours and hours doing memory interventions. That's not necessarily what we're saying. Within the classroom, we can help demonstrate those skills, model them. So first of all, make a conscious effort. And by that, I mean, raise it to the awareness of the children. So when I said to you, I want you to remember this shopping list, immediately you're thinking, I need to remember this information. So make it explicit that they need to remember some information. Use those strategies that we talked about, model them and teach them. So memory by association, for example, repetition, chunking. Use numbers to help. So for example, if you're giving instructions, I'm going to give you 3 instructions. Use fingers to demonstrate, use fingers as we go through each one. There's some visual cues there. There's something to grab onto rather than just the auditory. And finally, in terms of memory, think about using both sides of the brain, which by that we mean, for example, those coloured pens will help to bring in that creative visual side and develop the associations there with things like in the example I showed you with the images and the colours there. Okay, just hand over to Sam for our last few things.
Thank you. So some self-help strategies. What our aim is to make our dyslexic learners as independent as they can be, from as young as they can be. Supporting that mind map, how to create a mind map, what does that look like, and how to support them in making notes. Making notes as a dyslexic learner is really, really difficult. So thinking of those older students that may be asked to do that a little bit more independently. Using assistive technology to support reading, things like reader pens. Lots of schools have C pens that are sitting around in classrooms and things. They can make all the difference between a dyslexic learner being able to complete a task independently and not complete a task at all. There's lots of technology out there. We use C pens within our centers, in our centres, and we also use technology called OrCam, and they allow our students to work independently. And lots of our students, particularly older students, that talk about wanting to work independently, wanting to complete work on their own, and this opens up some of the doors to them to be able to do that. Using a laptop and typing can also help support with the writing side of things. Again, typing skills are vital, not just for now at school, but beyond that, and can really help as our children get older. The likelihood is that they are going to need them in whatever world of work they go into. Speech to text technology used to be very expensive, and there's lots of things on the market that you can still buy, but a lot of that is now free on Word. There is a dictate button, and you can talk to your computer and it will type all your ideas out for you. I must stress, it does not like my Hull accent, and some words do need to go back and be checked. But sometimes just for our students to see that their ideas can get out of them and onto the page can really encourage them to continue working and to continue working independently as well. Our dyslexic learners are more likely, research shows those with specific learning difficulties are more likely to have emotional difficulties, self-esteem difficulties, all that confidence. But using their strengths to help support that. So identifying where they are strong. We talk about lots of our learners being very good and being very good, strong verbally, and being able to express their ideas in different ways. Our learners often have to work much harder than their peers around them. So to produce possibly less work in the same amount of time, but they're working twice as hard to be able to do that. So that can be quite draining and tiring, but it can also be quite upsetting when you can see other people around you achieving much more than you, even though you know that you're putting in all that effort that's there. And supporting confidence and building on those strengths to support our dyslexic learners, again, will help them to achieve not just now in the classroom, but well beyond that. We talk about confident and confident children make confident adults and things like that, and those who are supported with their mental well-being, you know, as children will go on to have those strategies and that support as they're older as well. Considering the bigger picture of dyslexia as well, so I'm just going to go through this really quickly. I know we're running over, I'm sorry. So in 2022, LinkedIn put dyslexic thinking as a skill set that now employers are looking for. Dyslexic thinking is identified as somebody who is you know, good at problem solving and things like that, and in this modern world, being able to solve problems quickly and in thinking outside the box and in a different ways is quite crucial. We and you are developing our problem solvers of the future, and being able to celebrate strengths and some of the positives of being dyslexic, and the positives of dyslexic, got them the wrong way around, dyslexia, are really important to our children and young people. So using those strengths is, you know, brainstorming those ideas, letting them share their ideas instead of having all that information delivered to them. Multisensory learning, using all those different senses to support whatever it is that you're teaching them, will enable them to remember it more likely. Create examples where they can go and problem solve for you, different parts where they can go and find the answer and support you in different ways. And celebrating extracurricular success, whether it's done within school or outside of school, whether it be sport or art or anything that they enjoy doing, will really help support them. Those small wins, celebrating those small wins, those small advances, those small positivities will impact their confidence, and everyone enjoys that positive feedback whenever possible.